Hi, good morning, everybody. I I hope you're all well. My name's John MacDonald Brown, and I am delighted to be hosting this morning's webinar, which I think will be really, really interesting. And we've got some amazingly experienced and articulate and very good storytellers to share some of their industry experience. So I just thought I'd set the scene. So this summer, interestingly, by mid-August, um, the UK's generation from solar had already eclipsed the previous year's total, and they're looking at about a 30% um, uh, year-on-year increase in generation. About 14 terawatt hours was what we've seen up to August. So an awful lot of generation, and there's been lots of really, really interesting stories going on. The government, through the task force, have set a target of 47 gigawatts of solar capacity in the UK by 2030. Given that we're at sort of between 18 and 20 right now, after 15 years, that's a very ambitious target. We've got three people here today who are extremely well equipped to navigate you through what's going on in the UK market from a development point of view, from a policy and this whole task force background. And we have a technical, one of the UK's leading infrastructure lawyers who's incredibly busy on a lot of enormous generating and storage projects. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I sort of hand over the floor to the panel. This is being recorded, so you don't need to be scribbling away, taking notes. You can watch the video afterwards. Because we're being recorded, if you are speaking at all, no bad language, please. And also, there should be plenty of time for questions. What we're going to do is give each of the three panelists, I'll introduce you to in a second, 10 minutes to talk us through what their areas of expertise and their experiences and where they see this going. And that should leave us 20 to 25 minutes for questions. If you want to post your questions, I've got a little screen here and I'll see them. I'm sure I won't be able to get to all of them, but I'll do my best. So without further ado, in the context of this 47 gigawatt target for the UK, and how we're going to get there, and what the things that we need to do more and the things we need to do less of. The three people we've got this morning are Alex de Souza from Lightsource BP. Alex is general counsel there, and she's got a huge, well, she's right at the heart of what is going on at the moment. Alex sat on the Solar Task Force, on the main committee, and working with the politicians and the industry. I actually sat on a subgroup which we fed into the really important people on the big group. And she is also sitting on the Solar Council, which I'm sure she'll tell you a little bit more about, so I won't go into that. After that, we're going to hear from Mark Owen Lloyd, who is currently developing, I'm pretty sure, the UK's largest solar farm, 840 megawatts. And they're going through the final stages of the sort of planning approval, so it's not quite done yet. But his stories and their experience is extraordinary. And finally, Richard Marsh, last but definitely not least, Richard Marsh, who's a partner at TLT, a leading infrastructure lawyer, will take things that Alex has said and things that Mark has said and give you some technical insight. So, Alex, over to you. It's time for me to sit back and be quiet. Tell us about what's going on, Alex.
Morning, everyone, and thanks, John, for the very generous introduction. So yeah, Alex de Souza, General Counsel for the EMEA region for Lightsource. So yeah, John asked me to sort of do a bit of scene setting as to what the roadmap was, how we got there. So this process started 2 years ago under Conservative government, who had a slightly different target, setting a 70 gigawatt at 2035 ambition. And the plan was to bring together industry to collaborate with DESNZ and Solar Energy UK to identify the key blockers that would prevent deployment to that 70 gigawatt target. In the interim, we had a general election, and it was great to see that the Labour government picked up all the work that was done to date, and actually, on a very robust basis, dusted off the recommendations, in fact, expanding them and embracing some of the more tricky political subjects, which the previous government, didn't want to go too close to, most appropriate for tabling planning, and pushed forward the publication for this summer. So the document was published in June. It sets out 72 recommendations for how we're going to get to 47 gigawatts. And I'll come to some of the analysis as to why we arrived at that number. And off the back of that, with the meeting for the first time next week, we've got a solar council, which will be made up of people that were on the task force, new industry representatives from the utility and rooftop sector. And importantly, we'll bring in key participants in the market like NESO, Ofgem, GB Energy, ENA, statutory consultees to make sure that we all collaborate and importantly monitor and are accountable for the implementation of the roadmap recommendations. So 47 gigawatt is the number we landed on. Just as some background, DESNZ, when they were doing sort of the deployment trajectory analysis, projected that if we had the old policy framework, i.e. business as usual, no change, we would only hit around 30 gigawatts by 2030. So that was the kind of impetus for a whole raft of reforms, many of which are not limited to and will impact broader sectors, not just energy infrastructure more generally, and we will benefit from that, some of which comes through in the planning and infrastructure bill. But we sort of landed on five or six buckets which needed to be addressed in order to hit 47 gigawatts, which was connections reform, rooftop, supply chain, skills, and a group that I chaired, which was communications, which is really working with others, which sought to address a very important part of the whole process, which was communities and stakeholder mapping and engagement. Now, in the background, while this has all been happening, there's been a huge amount of parallel policy development, which has been really positive. And in fact, in some levels, has eclipsed some of the work done by the roadmap. We might be able to sort of say some of the recommendations have already been addressed, notably around planning, which Richard will deal with in a bit more detail when we come to kind of particularly NSIP projects. One of the things that will happen at the end of the year is that the NSIP threshold will step up to 100 megawatts, which is great, and bring sort of medium-sized projects back into the TCPA process. But we've also had a huge amount of development in connections reform. We've had a big push on things like the Solar Stewardship Initiative. We've had already the Office for Green Jobs sort of in the offing. So there's been a lot of focus on some of the other areas which were already identified. I think I'd be amiss if I didn't touch on connections reform, given some of us are probably recovering from that. So, the Gate 2 process, the submissions are just finished. We should be, if we stay on the same timetable, hearing which projects come through at DNO and TSO level in September and October. And I think if we kind of talk about if we're going to hit targets, one of the things we kind of have to then address, consider is how that queue will then be managed. Who's going to be the winners and the losers? Are they going to be the right projects? How will we manage the natural attrition? And then will we actually be able to manage the queue going forward? And I think one of the interesting things that will come out of that is if we need to activate the progression commitment fees because we have not enough projects reaching planning submission. And then as we progress the queue, the really tricky part, which is what a lot of the reforms are sort of addressed towards, is planning and how we can facilitate, the increasing number of large-scale projects that are going through the NSIP process, and how we can facilitate more appropriate decision making within local planning authorities, which I think is something most of us in the industry have had to tackle at some point or another, and the right balance between flexibility and appropriate decision making and democratic oversight. And I think there's some interesting indicators from the roadmap and in policy around things like implementing national schemes of delegation. Are we having decisions with the right people at the right time and the right place? And there's other mechanics that that will help sort of progress, I think, some of the roadblocks around planning. I think I'll leave it at that because we've got so much other good stuff to get through. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Alex. Just a quick clarification point. I've NSIP, just for those who aren't familiar, because yesterday there were so many acronyms. I've actually got a whole page of them here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So nationally significant infrastructure projects. So these are projects which go through, which are effectively determined by the planning inspectorate and Secretary of State. I'm not going to jump ahead. Rich is going to go in this in more detail, but you kind of have at the moment a threshold of 50 megawatts. Projects below that sit with local planning authorities and go through a Town and Country Planning Act. Projects above that go through the different scheme and have to get a DCO order from the Secretary of State.
Thanks, Alex. Just a couple of if I could just pick up a couple of things. So business as usual gets us to 30. So that's sort of a 50% increase from where we are roughly over the next 5 years. Last year, I think the 24 on 23 was about 10%. So it's kind of in line, right, with that. And then you picked out there were more areas, obviously, but of these areas you picked out: rooftop grid, supply chain skills workshop, planning. What is the I'm sure there'll be questions about grid later. So and it's definitely not sweeping it under the carpet but that's a kind of very
webinar in itself.
Yeah, and that's more than anything else kind of a national grid and central government sort of solution. I guess it's really about how do they pay for it and what do they need to do and where and when. But of the other bits that you talked about, which one, because there's a lot of things to try and line up to get to 47.
Yeah.
What's in your view, the absolutely critical one of all of those? What is take that away and the whole thing falls apart?
Maybe I'm slightly biased because this was the group that I chaired, but and I think the guys are going to guess where I'm coming from, but I personally think that all the policy reform, if you're going to go down to one thing that needs to go with it for it to be successful, is a positive national conversation around the need for renewables and why it is appropriate for the world we live in today. And that means that fundamentally, and it does come back to planning, that we've got to have the right projects in the right place. They have to be appropriate projects, which is sensitively developed. We have to have a social license to operate. And therefore, the planning process is to do a good job at making sure all the stakeholders that are impacted by these projects are consulted and that their considerations are taken into account. Not everyone is going to get everything that they want, but I think it's very important that people are heard. And I think there is a lot of work that has been done around that. Things like the community benefit consultation that's going on, whether or not shared ownership is appropriate. I think there's some good work that's been done by Solar Energy UK with its community engagement good practice guide. But I think the industry as a whole is slowly waking up to the fact that we can have connections reform, we can have a strategic spatial and energy plan, we can have planning reform. But if we don't bring the general public with us to understand why we need these projects, there will be roadblocks which delay the delivery of these projects and which put this 47 gigawatts at risk.
Thank you, Alex. That's yeah. I mean, that paints a picture. Thank you. I mean, everything in life comes down to communication, doesn't it?
It does. Well, in this new world, I think it does. I mean, but the fundamentals underneath have to be right. And I think that's why we've got to get the right mix of policy, implementation of policy, and then making sure people understand that that's why we have that new framework and we're going in that direction.
Yes, it's I mean I run a business, and when you try and change things, um you have to sort of, what is it, mirror signal maneuver, right? Why are we doing it? Why is it important? What's going to happen? And sometimes I'm maybe in too much of a rush. I'm sure some of my colleagues, well, I can see a couple on the list here, probably sniggering, but it is about that, and that I'm sure we'll come back to that, particularly in the spectre of, dare I say, reform and people like that. That positive conversation is a really challenging one, which is extraordinary given the public approval ratings of solar, which are in the high 70s. There was a government research carried out in 2024. I think it was 77%, and only 3.5% of people so they didn't approve. So there were a few, obviously, sort of abstainers or agnostics. But so given that, it is interesting that we still have this battle. Thank you, Alec. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, no, I guess the another reason it's important is because if we don't get it right and the projects aren't approved, which should be approved, ultimately it comes back to taxpayer as well, because you get projects going through judicial review and appeal processes which shouldn't be. And again,
Yeah,
that's not good for anyone either. So we kind of make sure that the fundamentals are good so the right decisions are taken.
yeah. I think, and I've got a funny feeling that Mark may well take us into this area as well. So thank you, Alex. I'm sure we will be back to you. Mark, as the lead on the largest solar development in the UK, 840 megawatts. We've obviously heard Alex talk about the background and the challenges. Well, welcome to the group. Tell us about what's going on and what your experiences have been, right at the front line, and where, what do we as a country need to do less of, and what do we need to do more of?
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, well, I'm very good to see you all, although I can't actually see you, but I'm aware of you. So my name is Mark Owen Lloyd. I'm working on Botley West Solar Farm, which is currently just the largest solar MSIP going through the DCO approval process. There are now 3 800 megawatt projects which have so we kind of led the way, and others have followed. Well, when we launched, 600 megawatts was the largest. So Botley West Solar Farm sits on, were it to be consented, 3,400 acres of land in West Oxfordshire, primarily owned by Blenheim Estate, which is and the trusts that own the estate and the palace. Of that 3,400 acres, 2,125 will have panels on it. So there's a very large area of our red line which have no panels. As I said to John yesterday, my background is as an energy trader. I was a fixed income and then an energy derivatives trader, and I managed a power, gas and carbon portfolio for E.ON UK and E.ON in Dusseldorf. So I went into this NSIP process slightly naively, I think, although having worked at E.ON, I was aware of the emotion that surrounds power generation and power prices. Our chief executive in Coventry had a guard on his house 24 hours a day, and had a bodyguard because we had threats made against him. So it does cause people to become unhappy. Talk of generation and what we do. So to give you how the timeline and how we came to interact with the people of West Oxfordshire. So I got the grid connection for Botley West in 2021, and in October 22 we launched our non-statutory consultation. So this, Richard, will cover how things are changing under the new planning infrastructure bill, but we used, as other solar NSIP sites, primarily Cleve Hill, which was then the only consented NSIP solar, and they had led the way. Start with the non-statutory consultation, which I think is probably the first mistake. So 22,000 breakfast tables in Oxfordshire received our pamphlet explaining what we were about to do, and probably 20,000 cornflakes were spat out, and immediately West Oxfordshire was energised to not to oppose us, but to hold us to account. Subsequently, we held 12 information events, public consultation events in the villages in and around. Blenheim is obviously based at Woodstock, so we had 2 in Woodstock and Blaydon and Hanborough and Tackley, all the villages, affluent, beautiful villages around our site. We had a 2-kilometre consultation area. So people came to these events, and I went to all of them as running the communications. I went to all of them expecting robust conversations about our plans. What I hadn't anticipated was the absolute opposition to what we were planning. And what I hadn't anticipated, although I should have, having been at E.ON, was the absolute fundamental lack of any understanding about what was happening to our generation system and what had happened to it since the EU carbon trading scheme was launched in 2005. So, I spent a lot of time explaining to people that the coal stations were closing. A lot of people said to me, but we have nuclear, why are we bothering with this? And when I said to one person in Woodstock, we're closing all our nuclear power stations by 2030, she absolutely refused to believe me. And I subsequently had to have an email conversation with her and prove to her that that was happening. So a very rapid dose of reality. We then had a long period of work of surveys and public engagement, and then launched our statutory consultation November, December 23, finished in February 24, submitted our application in November 24, accepted 12th of December 24, and we started our examination in front of 4 examiners of the examining authority on May the 13th. This year. It will finish on November the 12th. We've got our second set of hearings starting October the 6th. So it's a long, arduous, expensive process. And I think if coming to it from outside, the first thing they'll say, you absolutely need to have a highly professional and experienced communications company working for you, which we do in the form of Counter Context, who worked on the Cleve Hill. And you also need to have very good lawyers, which we do have, and there's a large number of highly experienced ones in London, and they are key to the hand-holding process to make sure because the Planning Act 2008, you've got to abide by every single one of its clauses and instructions. In terms of what I learned from it and what we've done is what I would do, and again Richard will cover this in the way things are being changed, but launching coals straight onto people's breakfast tables like that was a mistake. For our second project, we will do what I think some projects have done, which is to hold information workshops and maybe design workshops, meet small numbers of people. And I did that after the first consultation. I decided that what we need to do, the consultation discovered our enemies, and Stop Botley West was formed immediately and started work. What I realised we needed to do was find our supporters. And John, you're absolutely right. There's significant support for solar. During our statutory consultation, an organisation called Public First polled in West Oxfordshire and discovered there was an 80% support for solar within 5 miles of people's homes. So even during the maelstrom of our statutory consultation, where Stop Botley West were really, really active, and there were posters everywhere saying no to large-scale solar. There was strong public support, but you have to go and find those people because they don't come to your consultations. The people who come to your consultations are the 5% of people who will lie down in the road to stop your lorries getting into the field. So it's really important to go find your supporters. And that's what we did. And I had a meeting it was an important meeting with a man who used to be known as John Gummer, who I knew from when he was one of Margaret Thatcher's cabinet ministers, but now as Lord Deben, former chair of the Climate Change Committee. I had half an hour with him, and he told me to go after the parish councils. He said when he got Sellafield, Sideswell consented, he focused on the parish councils and getting them to listen to what his proposals were. So I did that. I had numerous meetings with parish councils. They arranged meetings so I could meet their parishioners. We had Q&A sessions, which were difficult often and were tough, and the questions were good. There were very few, questions which didn't have a solid point and required a solid answer. And that actually has been the tone of the opposition, is the quality of it hasn't just been shouting at it. It has been valid questions about why we're here. And I think also what we'd have done is try and explain, and I don't think central government does this well enough, and I don't think the major newspapers or media outlets do much to do this, is to explain to people this extraordinary transformation that we're enacting on our energy system, the removal of fossil fuels from it, from transport, from households, from power generation, and the actual electrification of our energy system, and what that means for, at the same time, for an energy system where we're closing all our power stations. I mean, all the power stations that I used when I was at E.ON to make money with are now closed. So it's a huge change. So in terms of we focused very firmly on community benefits. So we're having people, we've set aside 30 hectares for people to grow food on, and we're working with a number of community food growing organisations. I would have liked to have done that from the very beginning, but we didn't. We just went out with our designs. So numerous lessons from that, and I think the real lesson of having started the examination is that actually, both for those who oppose and those who support us, the real meat of the argument and the activity really started when we were accepted and when the examination started, because for the first time, after 2.5 years of shouting, you're in front of the referee, you're in front of the examiner, and suddenly it's all about evidence, solid fact. Both sides have to do that, have to answer. I mean, we've just answered at deadline 4 over 100 questions from the examining authority. So that is when the meat of it really begins. So this is going to be covered by Richard after me, but I think what we really need to do is get that the DCO process truncated so you get faster to the examination. That means that things will get consented or decisions will be made faster, and we'll build what we need to build much quicker.
Thank you, Mark.
Leave that to you, John.
There's loads of, I'm conscious of time a little bit, there's loads of questions that come out of that for me. That continuing on Alex's theme, and I it is the communication bit, right? And I really like that. I think it's really interesting is find your supporters.
Absolutely.
It's kind of, I wouldn't have looked at it that way. I think that's a really interesting way of putting it. It sounds so obvious, but you tend to spend your time trying to respectfully placate, answer questions of all of the people who are against. But actually, assuming there's some sort of, it maybe isn't 80% of the people who live locally who are supporting it, but they are probably largely supportive of solar. Is how do you get them? Have you managed to harness that? Because people are much more likely to complain online, right? They will say, if you're at a restaurant, people are more likely to complain than they are say that was brilliant. It's the natural emotional response. Have you managed to harness your supporters to help you in any way? Smooth over, placate, etc. some of the opponents, or they just implacable?
Yeah, no, they actually, and that's why I wish we'd done it sooner and gone and found these people, because as I said, the 80% who are pretty much supportive of solar are a silent 80%. They don't come to your event. So they just get on with their lives and go, yeah, it seems like a good idea to me. But so yes, Charwell Collective, which is a local food poverty organisation, runs food recycling schemes. It takes all the bread from Gales in Summertown, that kind of thing, and it also it's going to be growing food on our site. Now they've been absolutely crucial. They support 8,000 families in food poverty in and around our site. You'd be amazed these villages have people in food poverty despite their chocolate box appearance. So they've been real evangelists for what we're doing, because they're at the heart of the low carbon economy that's coming. They encourage recycling. They have toy libraries where people can exchange toys rather than buying new stuff. It's all about reducing the footprint. And the second organisation was called Low Carbon Hub, who encourage microgrids and own a number of small solar and wind installations in Oxfordshire. What they did was they came to all our statutory consultation events and set up a stand in the corner away from us and encouraged non-partisan conversations. And they were extraordinary, because people would come to their table and say, I'm a bit nervous of talking to the developer or expressing any support because it's socially not greatly acceptable and there are a lot of opposition there. But they were able to they were able to say to Low Carbon Hub, what's the tea? What is happening here? And they were able to have good conversations, which we couldn't have because obviously we're snake oil salesmen. So they were, yes, there's the answer.
That's brilliant.
Crucial and really important.
Thank you, Mark. I'm sure there'll be some questions. We definitely want to leave some time for questions. So you've communication planning. Obviously, nothing can be done without planning, and that is a hearts and minds thing as much as that. Obviously, NSIP, the National Significant Infrastructure Projects process, is but there's lawyers and what have you, which leads neatly on to Richard, who's one of the UK's leading infrastructure lawyers. And I think it's fair to say there's no way we're going to get to 47 gigawatts if we don't have some very big projects, right? One of which is Mark. So Richard, from your seat, advising developers and what have you, what are you seeing? Kind of, what are you seeing out there? What changes? I think really importantly, because if we've got to get things done, things need to change. As Alex said, status quo, 30 gigawatts. What needs to change from your perspective in the planning process, Richard?
Yeah, thanks, John, and for what Alex and Mark have said before. So the original remit was to talk about lessons learned from the planning process, but because we are currently in this massive state of flux in planning, some might say we always are, I think it's useful to give a brief summary of where we are at the moment and how that should improve the system. So first of all, just to touch upon a point that Alex made, this webinar is about large-scale solar. That could be TCPA or DCO, but there will be I'll focus largely on DCO because that's where the majority of the proposals for reform have come from.
Richard, acronym alert.
Yeah, so I'll
Because
probably
not everyone will know that.
the next 10 minutes explaining acronyms. So TCPA, Town and Country Planning Act, so local projects decided at a local level by the LPA, Local Planning Authority. At the moment, that is for solar schemes of less than 50 megawatts, or MW. For large-scale solar, the planning regime is currently above 50 megawatts or above. That's decided at a national level. And the process is run by the planning inspectorate, and then the decision is eventually made by the Secretary of State. Mark's talked a bit about that process. It's a largely sort of time fixed process, divided roughly pre-application and then post submission, roughly similar timescales. And a lot of the reforms that are currently in train relate to speeding up that process, making sure that the pre-application process is as streamlined as possible. And also that there are opportunities to fast track the process once the application is submitted, and even when we get to the decision-making processes as well. So Labour have obviously come in and made various planning decisions on solar almost immediately after coming in from a DCO scale perspective, which has been welcomed. And there are now a raft of reforms that are coming through in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which hopefully will make its way through by the end of this year. Now, on Monday, a consultation came out on this very point, so streamlining the planning process for national infrastructure projects, which obviously includes solar. And responses on that are due by the 27th of October. So I urge everyone to have a read of that. That covers the entire process from pre-application to a decision being made. And there are certain key things in there which I'll touch upon now. Just in relation to TCPA, we've already had updates to another acronym, the NPPF, so the National Plan Policy Framework, which has sort of slightly improved the position in relation to those projects from a consenting perspective and giving support for clean energy. But in terms of the NSIP stuff, Alex mentioned the change of threshold, which for both wind and solar will be 100 megawatts by the time that the bill comes in, and there's been an amendment to the Planning Act, i.e. the 2008 Act, which governs the process for DCOs. I'm not sure if we've mentioned what the DCO acronym yet, but I'm sure everyone attending will know, but it's a development consent order. So essentially a planning permission for an NSIP. So the threshold for solar will increase from 50 to 100, meaning larger schemes, which seem to be possibly more straightforward, can actually go the local route rather than DCO. There will also be the ability, or there is the ability at the moment, for schemes that don't fall within the DCO regime to be directed in via what's called the Section 35 direction. And that's basically applying to the Secretary of State to say, we think our scheme is nationally significant and we'd like to go the DCO route. Now, that may be because the DCO route brings all sorts of benefits, including the ability to compulsorily acquire land and rights, which is obviously very powerful for a private developer, particularly in relation, say, if your solar scheme is remote from the point of connection, you may need those rights in order to construct your grid connection. It may be that the local authority is particularly difficult and opposes your scheme, and therefore it's easier to take that decision making from local level to Secretary of State level. There may be other reasons as well. I mean, a DCO is very powerful in terms of combining all sorts of consents into one powerful unit. Another hopefully a powerful aspect of this reform is directing out of the DCO regime. So even if post changes you're above the threshold, it may be beneficial to actually go local if you've got a supportive local authority, if you don't need those compulsory acquisition powers, and if you want the speed that the local planning regime provides.
Richard, I was just going to ask you that. Start to finish, start to finish on a sort of level pegging basis, the TCPA, the Town and Country Planning Act routes versus the NPIF. You're starting on the same day. How long does it take? No abnormals. How much longer does it take on the end?
So in terms of local, you could be in that pre-application phase for around a year or so. So you'll still have to do all your surveys, environmental impact assessment, but there's no requirement to consult, although most developers will. Then once you submit, again, as long as you've got a compliant local authority that's well resourced, big caveat, then if it's EIA development, then it should get approved within 16 weeks and go to committee. Then obviously you've got the issues of non-determination, delays in determination, support by your officers, but then a refusal at committee, and then you get into to appeal. So that's where the uncertainty is. With the DCO route, again, pre-application phase is not defined as such or fixed. It could be a bit longer purely because of the sheer scale of the development. So some massive schemes may be in pre-application for 4 to 5 years, but more straightforward solar schemes maybe could get through in just over a year. Again, depends on the timing of your ecological surveys, wintering birds, that kind of thing. And then once you submit, the planning inspectorate's got 28 days to accept the application, and then you get into your relatively or generally fixed timescales of 6 months of examination, 3 months of the examining authority writing up their report, and then 3 months for the Secretary of State to decide. So if all goes to plan, the NSIP regime is longer, but it gives certainty as to timescale, but also certainty as to decision, because the success rate of DCOs is much higher at around 90, 95, 96%. So there are all sorts of additional benefits.
Richard, we've got is it a killer?
I'm just going to
Yes,
very quick make a very quick point, because this is a key part of the consultation. It is the proposal to remove the statutory requirement to consult on development consent order projects, which is quite a big thing. So that should come through when the raft of changes come through to the legislation and secondary legislation. Now, points that Mark has already made, which I don't think will change. Yes, there will no longer be a statutory requirement to consult, but I think the important thing to note and to understand, which will come through in the new guidance, is the benefits of consultation. So it shouldn't just be seen as a tick box sort of lip service exercise, but it should be seen as a process which enables your development to make iterative changes through the pre-application process, to understand the environmental impacts of your project, and to understand where your project sits in the local environment and how it's going to be received by local communities. And Mark mentioned during his piece about the evolution and the movement of Botley West through the process, that I'm sure we all have regrets or lessons learned, but to be able to take those steps early in the process to engage with the relevant community bodies, statutory bodies such as Natural England and the Environment Agency, but also landowners as well, to make sure you've got options tied up early in the process. So you're ticking things off. So it won't necessarily be from a statutory perspective. So you won't need to produce a consultation report for submission with the application. You won't need to do a preliminary environmental information report, another acronym, PIA. So it's making the entire pre-application process far more proportionate. And then by the time you submit your application, PINS is looking at the overall quality of the application and the consultation that's taken place, rather than going through this painful process and requirements of statutory consultation, which everyone gets bogged down in. So that will massively hopefully reduce the time spent in pre-application, and the government predicts that will result in a very round number of £1 billion worth of savings overall during the term of this Parliament.
Richard, we've got to jump in there because some of this may be covered in questions as well. Sorry to jump in. It's always difficult when you're the third one, so it's not that I've been there. It's not that you've. if anyone would like to ask some questions, there's a Q&A button. If you could start popping some in, that would be brilliant. We've got sort of 15 minutes where where the panel are really happy to look at consider any questions that you've got. There are so many things that come out. It's just the list goes on. The things I've noted down here that came out of all the bits here, and we sort of seem to have landed on planning, right? I don't think that was necessarily by design. I mean, I know you were a planning lawyer, but Alex and Mark weren't brought it. But it wasn't the kind of let's talk about. But it's absolutely, I guess, Alex's point, planning and communication, because sure, the rest of it, I mean, it's all important. It isn't that it isn't, but this takes a long time and it costs a lot of money. And there's a lot of public money risk, I think, seems to me, of planning appeals and things like that. And you hear stories about the amount of money spent on the Dartford Tunnel. Have you seen that? The guy in the parliamentary committee talking about how much money spent, more money on planning applications than I think, was it Norway spent building a tunnel of the same length itself. So that's a real problem. While we're waiting for some questions, no one's popped up with any yet. So we can just carry on having oh, here we go. So we've got a question from Edward Harwood Scorer. I don't know whether you can see this, but is the NSIP threshold increase, so 50 to 100, genuinely positive? Are we really optimistic about it? He makes, I think, a very fair point, because you mentioned about resource, Richard, and I haven't met many local authorities that are particularly well resourced. Given their resources, do you think they can actually handle a 99.9 megawatt application?
So I think this is where, so I mentioned the increase in the threshold coupled with the existing this Section 35 direction process to direct into the regime, but also then the ability to direct out. So the whole idea is there will be complete flexibility in how you want your project to be consented based on local circumstances, whether you need compulsory acquisition powers, etc. So at a local level, it may be that your local authority doesn't have the resources or is opposed for whatever reason, and therefore you can take the DCO approach. So although yes, clearly there may be local issues and not all local authorities will be tooled up, the idea is another aspect which I didn't actually come onto, but this concept of cost recovery by local planning authorities and statutory bodies means that although it will be financially painful for developers, that will enable, hopefully, in theory, applications to go through quicker, whether that is local applications or DCO. There will also also be the ability for those costs to be scrutinised by the Secretary of State. So it's not a blank check to require the developer to pay any costs. So the whole idea is flexibility, different options for the developer to go the route they want.
And maybe put a bit more jeopardy on the local authorities who seem to willy-nilly go to appeal, and it doesn't bother. Alex, were you going to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, because I think it was, to be honest, it was industry that was pushing for the threshold to be increased, because there was this sort of space around medium-sized solar where, and what we haven't touched on is the massive change in cost between a local TCPA application and a DCO consent, because the amount of statutory consultation you have to go through, the time period means it's from hundreds of thousands to tens of millions, for each of them. So that was why there was a space where it was not economic to have a 60 megawatt project necessarily have to go through an NSIP process. I think unless the reforms that they're proposing to facilitate local decision making are implemented, particularly around you know, one of the parts of the planning infrastructure bill was letting local authorities charge fees so that they can put that back into training and the decision-making process. I think that's fundamental. They've announced 47 million to sort of train up more case officers. Part of this and planning inspectors, because the planning inspectors deal with the appeals. I think that's another thing. So you get a bottleneck is the more appeals that go through at a local level, the planning inspector not only has to deal with the NSIP projects, but also has to deal with the appeals. And there's been a real shortage of qualified planning inspectors that have been available to deal with this glut of sort of projects coming through on both sides. I think the national scheme of delegation, and if that is effective, will be fundamental, because the idea is mandatory training will have to be given to LPAs. So the members of the committee should be better tooled. And secondly, if a project is, you know, already foreseen to be in the local plan, if it is supported by the case officer, there'll have to be good reason for it to go to committee, and that will be set. Those reasons will be set at a national level, not a local level. So it may depoliticize it a little bit as well. Sorry.
You, John.
Sorry, I was just talking to my wife. Yeah. We've got a few more questions. It's really interesting, that whole plan. I mean, I guess that's a real action. Is 47 million quid to train up some more planning officers. Slightly worried, but you know, many people said, "Well, that sounds great," and it does take time to be a really good planning officer. Something that was mentioned. Actually, Mark, by you and Alex, you touched on it, is the whole community part, right, of these projects. You know, what in my old days in real estate was sort of Section 106 is basically what have you got to put in to bluntly to help smooth things over. And you talked about I wrote down somewhere however many hectares of land and what have you. So Simon Ward has asked a question here, and let's try and be really, really quick on these. What economic and social benefits are we most keen to demonstrate from these? I'm guessing, Simon, correct me if I'm wrong, from these projects, I think is probably what you mean. Mark or Alex, whoever gets there first.
Yeah, very quickly, we wanted to try and increase the way we touched locally beyond generation of electricity, because there was some skepticism about whether we consumed locally since it's going to the grid, and that's a long conversation. But so we've got a £450,000 community benefit fund annual payment, which will be administered by a committee set up by the parish councils, with no restrictions on what it's used for, so that'll be their decision. We've also got 30 hectares of community growing area, and we're writing applications for people who want to set up allotments. We've got people growing food to sell to the Oxford colleges, or Chilwell Collective doing these things called food forests, which is to teach people how to grow their own food. And of course, we'll be paying between £1.5 and £2 million in business rates on a basic level. And one of the key ones, which people are sceptical about, is Oxfordshire's grid is completely at capacity, and we're having a new substation built for us, which will free up capacity for the DNO, Scottish and Southern Energy Network. So our project will enable more capacity in the distribution network operators system. At the moment, you can't get a connection for demand or generation in Oxfordshire. It's full. So that's a key benefit.
In fact, I think there's some real imagination there as well in the solutions you've come up with. Alex, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick on what Mark was saying, I mean, I think if you look at one of if you were to sort of the tracking concern of the general public, one of the key issues is loss of agricultural land, which is not wholly based in necessarily the right facts. I mean, if you were to hit 47 gigawatts, it's less. I think it's 0.4% of land will go to solar, which is less than golf courses in the UK at the moment. So, you know, but it is a real concern. And so, you know, in the UK, in every market that I do in Europe, it's the same concern, like, is the right land being developed? And in the UK, there are particular requirements around, you know, the type of land that you can even develop. It can't be best and most versatile agricultural land. But more importantly, you've got to bring landowners with you. And then something I just wanted to touch on, because it's increasingly important topic that maybe isn't talked about. We've also got to bring tenant farmers with us, because they're not landowners. So something that's coming up more is making sure it's not just owners, it's broader stakeholders that you bring with you, and making sure that, you know, it's not just, you have to have ownership in the project, it's not just ownership via the land. And that's why I think that the responses to the consultation and how you manage how land is brought in to these projects, is it optioning land? Is it working with the landowners and with the tenants? I think that's going to be fundamental.
Thanks, Alex. Let's try and do. We've got about 2 minutes, so let's try and punch through a couple of quickies. We've got a couple of anonymous attendees. Kirsty Lodge, if we can have a really quick answer to this. Something that's not been touched on is the need for developers to secure land through voluntary agreement at an earlier stage, right? That's obviously part of the Gate 2 process if you're going down that route. Option easements, its options, easements, etc. This will help developers to reduce queries around compulsory acquisition during hearings and later by the Secretary of State, which can reduce costs during examination and de-risk the project in terms of deliverability. Does the panel agree? So I think the question there is, by securing your land earlier, do you agree that this reduces costs and de-risks the project? I would say yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no question about it. And I think it's an interesting point. I think Mark, or what you made yesterday, or possibly you, Alex, is actually the amount of applications that are in there for grid connections from people who have no land rights, and that this Gate 2 process is designed to flush them out. And I mean, a quick question on that. The government have talked about freeing up or removing 80% of the capacity that's been applied for across transmission and distribution, as far as above 5 megawatts. I think I'm right in saying that's what they're saying. That's what their aim is. Where do you think they will get to, as a sort of closing question? Because it's a massively important thing, and no one's going to hang you for it. Your answer, Alex.
Well, I think the interesting part is with the strategic alignment tests that form part of the process. So it's not just bringing up the queue, and that's what the whole Gate 2 process was meant to do. But it's like, now I think the test will be, if we got the right projects in the right place, and then what happens with attrition? Because I mean, I haven't got the numbers on top of my head. Let's say they want 2 gigawatts of not just solar, but BESS in Wales or whatever, and there is some attrition. Can they pull the right projects in to make, you know, to deliver the strategic plan? And I think that's the question. So I think that will be enough projects. I mean, I understand at the end of last year there were a terawatt of grid applications in. And I think NESO was getting, you know, nearly 2,000 applications coming through on an annual basis. So it was unsustainable. There aren't a shortage of projects. I think the question is, there are the right ones now.
Thank you. We might that I think could be our time's up, I think. But I've got, until we get covered, I'll ask one more question from someone in Northern Ireland. And they say the major hold-up in planning process is statutory consultee responses not being submitted within the deadline. Okay, and planners won't make any decisions unless they get them. If you're a developer and this happens, what can you do to mitigate that? Are there any alternatives? Richard, Mark, that's probably one for you, one of you two. I can see this happening.
I suppose it goes down to whether it's TCPA or DCO, that early engagement and the direct engagement. So in both processes, you can, with key stakeholders, you can undertake a discretionary advice service, early engagement, so you can be on the front foot and deal with issues rather than waiting for an LPA to consult.
So if you know they're going to be, I don't know, English Heritage or even the CAA, engage with them right at the beginning So I
Yeah,
guess
it's-
they then go, yeah.
Yes, at a point where your scheme is sort of suitably developed to enable that proper engagement.
And I've got one final one here, which is close to my heart. There seems to be an integrated focus on large utility scale opportunities. My world is this world, which is how is this balanced with the significant potential for rooftop solar PV, especially consider, for example, national logistics rooftop opportunities. Alex, I don't know whether we've lost you or not, but this is you were in the task force and are now holding the feet to the fire. Could you just give us a quick insight into where rooftop sat in this whole thing?
Sorry, I'm actually just being kicked out of my meeting room in the office at the same time.
Outrageous.
So, outrageous, but fair. Rooftop had its own independent subgroup, and I think what was very clear is that the focus needed to be more focus at sort of a key decision-making level on rooftop. Now, there's been some big moves already, like sort of solar now will form part of the mandatory requirements and future home standards, and you've already seen a massive leap in residential deployment off the back of that, and I think that's exciting.
Yeah.
There's been more alignment within the industry. We've got a steering committee just for rooftop as part of the Solar Energy UK sort of structure as well. So you'll see there's a lot of initiatives. There are a number of challenges to rooftop around connections and planning in itself, particularly around the commercial space. But I can say there will be increasing focus on that because the rooftop revolution is definitely part of the government plan.
Thank you, Alex. And just from my experience sitting on the rooftop bit of the task force, there were really interesting things came up, some of which I think wouldn't be very popular, but might be quite effective. So talking, because the big challenge, I don't know who it is who put the question in. None of us attended. It might be one of my team just trying to get rooftops on the radar. But the things like league tables of landlords or large occupiers, supermarket groups, and voluntary league tables, right? And it is quite interesting because when CRC reporting started off, all the listed businesses were on it, and they all wanted to beat the other ones, and then for some reason the government removed it. No explanation why. I think that is us. We've gone over 5 minutes. Alex, Richard, Mark, thank you so much for your contributions and your time. As I said, I could talk. We could chat all day about this stuff, and it is truly fascinating. Richard's got his hand up.
One very quick point. So we're hosting Waterfront's third solar conference in January. So there will be a hell of a lot more time
Yes.
to discuss all these reforms and changes that wasn't allowed today.
Thank you
Thanks
so much.
all.
Thank you for saying that, Richard, because that was on my list and I completely forgot. Yes, it's in is it October?
It's January.
January the 15th, I think it is, isn't it?
Yep.
And we'd love to see as many of you as possible there. I hope that you go away from this having learned something that you didn't know before. If you do need any help on the planning front from a very good lawyer, Richard's your man. And if you want to talk about war stories on planning on enormous projects, have a pint with Mark. And
or have you got some land? I'd love to talk to you.
Listen, thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your days and your day. Thank you, Richard, Alex, and Mark. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Bye.